Okay, great. Okay, thank you very much. And hello and welcome to Learning from Home, and welcome to the Hewlett-Woodmere Public Library's profile of the Grimm brothers, called Grimm Tales, having a little fun with that title there. My name is Dr. Bill Thierfelder, and I'll be your host today. For those of you who don't know me, I'm a retired professor of arts and humanities and a docent emeritus from the American Museum of Natural History in New York. I live in Portland, Oregon, where I'm speaking to you from today, and where I'm an artist, writer, and lecturer. I also return regularly to New York, where I continue my work at the museum and enjoy the wonders of the Big Apple. Now, since we can't cover everything about this topic in one presentation, I'd like to invite you to take a deeper dive on my website, which is makingwings.net. And in this case, it's deeper dive number 9. So let me take you there. You should be seeing this now. And if you go to the upper left corner, this is the home page. If you go to the upper left corner, you'll see a menu and a drop down. By the way, if you're interested, you can visit any of these. And if you're interested in any of my future programs, you can go to Library Schedule. There are a group of deeper dives here. And we're going to go to number 9. So that's in the first batch here. Click on the downward arrow, not the words, but the arrow, and you will see Grimm fairy tales. You may visit any or all of these other pages. These represent programs that I have given or I will be giving in the near future. So Grimm fairy tales. And what you're going to see here is an overview, some recommended media. I'll be talking about some of these books in the actual presentation, but if you don't have a paper and pencil handy, the titles and the books are here on the authors, I should say, are here on my website. Um, I have some printed resources, some video resources, a timeline. Okay, I don't want to make you too dizzy here. The Grimms had a wonderful brother named Ludwig, who was a very noted, as you can see, a beautiful painter and engraver. We'll be talking about him a little bit too. And then some experts on fairy tales, Jane Yolen, Max Luthi. We're going to be talking today about myths, legends, and folk tales, the differences. And then today we're going to be focusing on 9 of those tales by the Grimms. And I have a whole bunch of really great stuff there for you to look at that I don't have time in the program to go over. Let me just go back here. As far as anything that you might see, let's say you want this biography from Wikipedia. If you click on that, you'll be brought to that page. When you're done, you click it off and you're back on mine. So it's one-stop shopping. So I hope you can take advantage of that. Would appreciate it. So everything that you're going to hear in this program today uses the web resources and books that you just saw on my website. But for this presentation, I especially used the following sources to build its structure and its script: the National Endowment for the Humanities and the University of Cincinnati, the writers Jack Zipes, Max Luthi, and Jane Yolen. JSTOR Daily. JSTOR has a repository of articles from many different scholarly journals, and some of those I use today. eNotes, and of course, Wikipedia and Britannica. Now, one of the things that you just saw on my website was suggested media. And here are 3 books that I have found very useful in my research. Donald Hatenga's The Brothers Grimm, Two Lives, One Legacy. Murray Peppard's Paths Through the Forest, a biography of the Brothers Grimm, and Jack Zipes' The Brothers Grimm, From Enchanted Forest to the Modern World. They're all excellent introductions to anyone who wants to know about these men and their revolutionary work. And there are other books that I also have up on the website. So here's what we're going to look at today. First, we'll look at a few biographical details about the Grimm brothers. And once again, if you want a complete biography, just take that deeper dive number 9 on my website, makingwings.net. Then we're going to discuss where the Grimm's work fits into the larger context of myths, legends, and folktales. And finally, we'll look at 9 of the 210 folktales in the Grimm Brothers' major publication called Children's and Household Tales. The complete text of each tale, as well as background information on each of the 9 stories that we'll be looking at, can also be found on my website. So, let's begin with a few words about the brothers themselves. Jacob Grimm was born first in 1785 and died in 1863. His brother Wilhelm Grimm was born 1 year after Jacob in 1786 and died in 1859. Uh, Now, they were extraordinarily close and lived their lives as academics, philologists, cultural researchers, lexicographers, and authors. Together, they collected and published folklore. They traveled throughout Germany and listened to oral versions of stories that some of which have been handed down for generations. And they unearthed often forgotten written versions of those stories as well. The brothers were born in a small town called Hanau in Hassel-Kassel, which is in Germany today, and spent most of their childhood in the nearby town of Steinau. Now, the map in the upper left of your screen shows that their hometowns were near the major city of Frankfurt. Now, along the bottom of your screen, you see Hanau and Steinau as they look today. There was also, by the way, a beloved younger brother who was born in 1790. Ludwig Grimm was close to his older brothers, Jakob and Wilhelm, and they, the older brothers, cared for Ludwig after their parents' deaths, and the older brothers supported his education as an artist. Now, their father's death in 1796 impoverished the family and affected the brothers for many years after, both economically and emotionally. They attended the University of Marburg, where they began a lifelong dedication to research the early history of German language and literature, including German folk tales. The Philipps University of Marburg, which you can see on your screen, was founded in 1527 by Philip I, who was the Landgrave of Hesse, kind of like a duke or a count. That makes it one of Germany's oldest universities and has the record still as the oldest still operating Protestant non-Catholic university in the world. So, in a nutshell, we have 2 brothers who literally lived with each other for their entire lives, even after Wilhelm got married and had children. The introverted Jakob, who remained a bachelor his entire life, was the more obviously intellectual of the 2, devoting his time exclusively to scholarship and academia. He was a librarian, wrote extensively on the history of the German language, began an all-inclusive German dictionary that was left incomplete at his death, and published important work about the history of law in Northern Europe. Now, the extroverted Wilhelm, on the other hand, was outgoing and became a dedicated husband and father of four children. His work as an anthropologist and folklorist was the core of his work with his brother. Together, the two of them traveled through Germany and its environs, listening to, reading, and collecting the stories that would end up being the essential reason for their fame today. Meanwhile, the rise of the Romantic movement in music, art, and literature, the word romanticism has nothing to do with love. Roman is the French word for book or story, and later generations eh, uh, kind of gave this period that name. So, Romanticism, the Romantic movement in art, music, and literature during the 18th century, revived an interest in traditional folk stories which represented a pure form of national literature and culture for the Grimms and their contemporaries. This is an important detail. When Aesop, for example, was writing his fables and tales in Greece during the 6th century BCE, he was creating didactic stories meant to entertain and teach. For the Grimm brothers, writing down the stories they collected in Germany and neighboring regions was a political act. It was an act of nationalism. Simply put, the Grimms didn't want German stories or the German versions of widely recognized stories to be lost. Now, while undertaking this comprehensive work, Jacob and Wilhelm established a detailed methodology for collecting and recording folk stories that's still used by historians and folklorists today. Well, between the first edition of Children's and Household Tales in 1812 and the seventh edition of that work in 1857, Jacob and Wilhelm revised their collection many times, so that over seven editions, the book grew from the initial 86 stories in 1812 to 210 in 1857. Now, on your screen, you can see two early editions, both of which featured lithographs and prints, including several by their brother Ludwig. And I've just put little arrows to the two that Ludwig did. They're really very beautiful lithographs. Now, obviously, after 200 years, the Grimm's folk tales have enjoyed enduring popularity. Their work is available in more than 100 languages and has been adapted numerous times by filmmakers, including trailblazing animated films by the Disney studios that are highly sanitized versions of the originals. Now, sadly, during the 1930s and 40s, the tales were used as German propaganda by the Third Reich, in much the same way that they used the operas of Richard Wagner. Fortunately, later in the 20th century, psychologists such as Carl Jung and Bruno Bettelheim, and scholars like Joseph Campbell, reaffirmed the value of folklore in spite of the cruelty and violence in the original versions of some of the tales, especially those by Grimm. Now, by the way, it wasn't just Disney who smoothed over the violence and cruelty. Even the Grimms themselves eventually softened some of the gore for varieties of reasons, including their own deep commitment to religious and moral Protestant ideals. Once again, if you want to learn more about these amazing men, I've included a detailed timeline of their lives on my website. You can see that there again. It's makingwings.net. By the way, as just a little quick sidebar, if you want a kind of a fun assignment for yourself, there are books available that have the original 1812 versions of some of the stories, and then the later stories from the other editions in the 1830s, 40s, and 50s. And it's really interesting to see what they changed. So even they Disneyfied themselves from time to time. Well, now, before we look at 9 specific stories that the Grimms collected, I want to explore for a little bit what we mean by terms like myth, legend, and folktale. For those of you who attended last month's lecture, we went over some of this, but for those of you who are new today, here's a different slant on myths, legends, and folk tales. And we're going to start with myth, which is arguably the earliest kind of storytelling. So, first off, a myth is a story, it's an account of something, an attempt by someone or a group to explain something. All myths are part of an oral tradition. All ancient myths were originally spoken stories. The vast majority created long before there was even a written language. This means that over time, there were constant changes and transformations. Think of the telephone game we played as kids. I tell you something, then you tell it to the next person, and he or she tells it to the next person, and so on. Well, what the last person hears is often quite different from what you first whispered in someone's ear. Well, myths often have a similar history. When these narratives finally got written down, several, sometimes even conflicting, variations of one story often came into existence. A third thing about myths is that most myths take place long ago and often far away. Think of all the creation stories told around the world, or stories of a universal flood. Number four, we really don't know who spoke the first versions of myths. Those first speakers, often priests, shamans, or soothsayers, are anonymous. Even when these myths eventually got written down, think of the Greek or Roman myths, for example, even those versions often remained anonymous until famous writers like the first century Roman poet Ovid attempted to gather some of these stories into a coherent volume, like Ovid did in his masterpiece, Metamorphosis. Number five, the principal characters of a myth are usually supernatural beings or supernaturally endowed humans. So, long before Marvel or DC Comics superheroes, there existed the gods, goddesses, and heroes of historic and prehistoric civilizations in Egypt, Greece, Rome, India, the Nordic regions, Japan, and China. Everywhere you look, every long-term culture you study, you will discover myths filled with remarkable beings. Now, our sixth point, the great importance of myth in ancient times caused them to become the basis for religions or cults, which leads us to number seven. Early religions created etiological myths. Okay? That means myths that explain the etiology, right? They explain the cause for things. And one of the great examples would be creation myths. How did the sun come to be created? How did the moon get in the sky? What are the stars? What is the cause of an earthquake or a flood? An etiological myth attempts to explain those things. Now, number 8 on the list cannot be emphasized enough. Archaeology and anthropology are important to the study of myths. The study of ancient civilizations, their day-to-day lives, and their beliefs help us better understand those ancient narratives that we call myths. And finally, number 9, in a nutshell, mythology is an attempt to explain that which cannot be readily explained. It is humankind's first attempt at science. Today, of course, we understand that true science is based on fact and empirical evidence, the evidence of fact finding. Now, with all of that said, How is myth different from legend? Well, first of all, in legends, the principal characters are human heroes or heroines. Joan of Arc or Charlemagne are all human beings rather than demigods or supernatural beings. Second, in legends, there's always a basis in some aspect of real human history, usually in the past. A terrific example of an upgrade from myth to legend happened in the 19th century when a series of archaeologists, including Heinrich Schliemann, conclusively discovered the site of the ancient city of Troy. For centuries, Troy and the famous war associated with it were considered a fabrication. Once the ruins were discovered, scholars had to re-examine what they once thought was a myth. And because there really is a history, it's now considered a legend. Now, as for number three, legendary figures tend to be drawn from nobility or aristocracy, though humble origins may figure importantly into the narrative. Joan of Arc, for example, seen on your screen, well, she's a great example. She had humble beginnings, but she rose in stature, becoming a general leading an army. Uh, right? Fourth characteristic of these wonderful legends is that they're usually full of hyperbole, of exaggeration. That's what hyperbole means, right? So, for example, the medieval epic poem about Charlemagne and his kingdom called The Song of Roland extols the monarch who, quote, has sat gloriously on the throne for 200 years. Obviously, he didn't, but such exaggeration served the purpose of showing the importance of a hero. And finally, legends are an attempt to create a historical basis for someone or something, an attempt to create a history for a group. Ancient legends attempt to answer questions like, what is the history of our town, village, or country? Or what was the founder of our nation like? And that then brings us to folk tales, also called fairy tales and sometimes fables. Folk tales would, of course, become the primary focus of the Grimm brothers' research. Now, is there a difference among the names? Well, though most laypersons might use the terms interchangeably, some scholars might argue subtleties. A folktale, for example, tends to deal with ordinary people, relying on their human abilities. A fairy tale usually has, well, fairies or other supernatural agencies like elves, pixies, or gnomes. And a fable often has a moral message to it. But again, for our purposes, the distinctions are subtle. First and foremost, we should remember that these stories always start out in an oral form before being written down. Secondly, almost all of these stories deal with ordinary people, and the once there was a king or once there was a princess kind of stories still tend to deal with basic ordinary human emotions. There's also a special branch of folk tales in which animals become the main characters. Those animals are almost always stand-ins for human beings. Now, the traditional name for these narratives is beast fables, Aesop fables, or George Orwell's Animal Farm are great examples. Third, these stories often show ordinary people interacting with nobility, monsters, or supernatural powers, which could include God or angels. Now, another thing to remember is that these stories were meant to entertain or teach, and they often were used to justify customary patterns of behavior. Little Red Riding Hood, for example, illustrates what happens when you fail to heed a warning. And Cinderella shows what happens if you remain pure and good as opposed to behaving like an evil stepsister. So, when you are speaking about Aesop or the anonymous writer of The Thousand and One Nights or the Grimm brothers, you are speaking about writers who wrote down previously known stories. But starting in the late Renaissance, you see the development of what's called the literary fairy tale or folk tale. Writers like Charles Perrault, Hans Christian Andersen, Lewis Carroll, and L. Frank Baum all wrote original stories, narratives that were not based on previously existing materials. They're original stories. Now, folklorist Jane Yolen puts it very simply. She says basically there are three kinds of folk stories: the oral, the transcribed, that would be the Grimm brothers, and the literary tale. And number six, it's key to a good tale. The main characters often have to overcome great obstacles. And in many cases, they must undertake what Joseph Campbell calls the hero's journey, a journey for a protagonist that goes from some kind of personal misfortune to some kind of redemption. And finally, number seven, as scholars like Carl Jung show us, folk and fairy tales are usually filled with archetypes: the abused child, the evil stepmother, the witch, the Cinderella type, the underdog, or the outcast, to name just a few. Now, before we move on, it's important to realize that the lines among these three categories, myth, legend, and folktale, are not solid. Some myths, for example, have fairy tale elements when, such as the enchantress Circe uh, transforms transforms Odysseus's crew into a herd of pigs in the Odyssey. And some legends have mythical elements. For example, most medieval legends have a strong emphasis on divine intervention. And Greek epics like the Iliad have legendary humans like Priam, the king of Troy, and Odysseus, the leader of the Greek army, interacting with gods and goddesses, as seen in the story of the Trojan horse. And some folk tales have both mythic and legendary aspects to them. A great example would be a film like Field of Dreams, which can easily be called a literary fairy tale. It's a classic example of mixed genres, a story filled with real-life baseball legends who miraculously return as enchanted ghosts. I hope that wasn't a spoiler for anybody. If you haven't seen the film, it's wonderful. Now, with that said, I'd like to look at 9 famous Grimm stories. Now, I will assume that most people are familiar with these tales, but in case you're not, you will find links to detailed summaries of each story, as well as links to the complete texts of those stories on my website, again, makingwings.net, deeper dive number 9. And in addition, I also provide you with links to background resources for each of the 9 stories, a little behind the scenes for each of them. So let's begin. And we're going to start out with Rapunzel, the story of a girl trapped in the tower of a wicked sorceress. The girl eventually escapes, but in a great plot twist, ends up rescuing her rescuer. Now, the Grimm's immediate source for Rapunzel was a story published by Frederick Schultz in 1790. The brothers saw, rightly, in Schultz's printed story, a tale with a previously long and widespread oral tradition, and they hunted that down. They hunted down the original oral tradition, and they would visit people around Germany and listen to their version of the story, and then they combined it with the Frederick Schultz version and came up with their own version. Now, for each of the stories that we're looking at today, I want to focus on a few key aspects. So, for Rapunzel, let's continue with this. According to Jungian psychologists, there are seven key feminine archetypes: the mother, the maiden, the queen, the huntress, the wise woman, the mystic, and the lover, and a host of subtypes that grow out from these. For Carl Jung, Rapunzel is an example of the maiden archetype. She is helpless or powerless in some way. She's often imprisoned physically, and in many ways, she is imprisoned psychologically. Well, like other maidens, Rapunzel has been wronged by a villain, in this case, a wicked enchantress, and a hero comes along to avenge that wrong on the maiden's behalf. Now, many psychologists and scholars also see Rapunzel's imprisonment as an example of the woman in the tower archetype. She's literally trapped in a phallus and must escape to become her fully female self. But this story also contains another aspect of many folk and fairy tales, especially those written in the Romantic era of the early and mid 19th century. The woman as healer, the woman as salvation, or the woman as the divine feminine. And from there, it's only a short step for the Roman Catholic Church in 1849, at the pinnacle of the Romantic period, to declare a woman named Mary as the Immaculate Mother of God, who was herself immaculately conceived. So we clearly see the image of the woman as healer, the woman as savior, at the end of the Rapunzel story, which I have now just put up on your screen. You can follow along if you'd like. The prince was overcome with grief, and in his despair he threw himself from the tower. He escaped with his life, but the thorns into which he fell poked out his eyes. Blind, he wandered about in the forest, eating nothing but grass and roots, and doing nothing but weeping and wailing over the loss of his beloved wife, Rapunzel. Thus he wandered about miserably for some years, finally happening into the wilderness where Rapunzel lived miserably with the twins that she had given birth to. He heard a voice and thought it was familiar. He advanced towards it, and as he approached, Rapunzel recognized him and, crying, threw her arms around his neck. Two of her tears fell into his eyes, and they became clear once again, and he could see as well as before. He led her into his kingdom, where he was received with joy, and for a long time they lived happily and satisfied. Yeah, there's still a mixed message in that ending, isn't there? The maiden Rapunzel, once trapped in a tower, and a single mother, thanks to the king's earlier visitations, is now a mature woman savior who heals the king. But it's the king who provides her ever after home. So some might argue that, well, she's back in the tower again, just not a literal one. Now, you have to remember that such readings, I mean, you might even call them feminist readings of these texts, are very much part of 21st century literary criticism, which brings us to a point that the folklore scholar Jane Yolen makes in her introduction to favorite folk tales from around the world. She says, many tales owe their setting, their archetypal characters, even bits of their magic to the past, but thematically, they draw upon the century and the place in which they were written, because authors are as deeply rooted in their society as their readers or listeners are. So, the 1812 version of Rapunzel is as much a piece of romantic literature as the original created at some point in the previous century. And the woman in the tower interpretation of Rapunzel is a reading that is very much a product of late 20th century and early 21st century scholars. And that's what makes these folk tales so wonderful. They're timeless and they speak to every generation across time. Well, next up is Hansel and Gretel, the story of a cruel mother, a lackluster father, a witch with a talent for baking, and two children who manage to outsmart the chef. Now, although Jacob and Wilhelm credited various tales from Hesse, the region where they lived, as their source, scholars have argued the brothers probably heard the story first in 1809 from the family of Wilhelm's friend and future wife, Dortchen Wild. And remember, in German, the W is a V sound, so it's not wild, it's wild. um, According to folklorist Jack Zipes, the tale emerged in the late Middle Ages, somewhere between 1250 and 1500. Shortly after this period, close variants like Martin Montanus's Gartengesellschaft, published in 1590, A Garden Stories, began to appear. And scholar Christine Goldberg argues that, let me put that here, do we have this? There we are. Christine Goldberg argues that the episode of the paths marked with stones and crumbs, already found in 17th century French versions of the tale, represents an elaboration of the motif of the thread of Ariadne. Remember, she gives a thread to Theseus so that he can escape the Minoan labyrinth. Further, a house made of confectionery, which the witch in this story has, is found as early as the 14th century British manuscript about the land of Cockaigne. In his trailblazing book, The Uses of Enchantment, eminent psychologist Bruno Bedelheim, some of my students found his writing a little difficult at time, and they called him Brutal Bedelheim. His name is Bruno. Bruno Bedelheim suggests several key folktale topics. Some of these are clearly present in Hansel and Gretel. Thrust out of their home by their mother, both children clearly suffer from separation anxiety. What Bedelheim calls starvation fear is at the core of the tale. The struggle for independence is plainly presented by the attempts to break free of the forest witch. Even this theme of sibling rivalry is subtly presented, with both the sister and the brother vying for solutions to their dilemma. Puberty in this story is not so much a sexual one, like we saw in Rapunzel, as it is a growing up experience about wisdom and stature. And finally, folktales often take place in dark or dangerous locations, like forests, caves, or dungeons. And in this case, it's the forest. We have to remember that until the urban age was in full swing, the forest surrounding your village was quite literally a place of lions and tigers and bears. Oh my. A powerful theme that you find in many folk tales is that of children lacking one or more parents, frequently involving the introduction of the wicked stepmother archetype, because daddy remarries, right? Now, in this case, in this story, the loss occurs, interestingly enough, at the end of the story rather than more typically at the beginning. Folklorist Jack Zipes, in The Golden Age of Folk and Fairy Tales, argues that the importance of Hansel and Gretel in the European oral and literary tradition may be explained by the continually used theme of child abandonment and abuse. Due to famines and lack of birth control, believe it or not, it was not uncommon in medieval Europe to abandon unwanted children in front of churches or in the forest. Further, the death of a mother during childbirth sometimes led to tensions after remarriage, and Zuyp proposes that it may have played a role in the emergence of the motif of the hostile stepmother. Now, you can see this so-called uh, loss of mother theme in the ending of the 1857 Grimm version, which I've just placed on your screen. And again, here, rather than at the beginning, the loss of the parent is basically alluded to at the end. Follow along with me. And finally, they, Hansel and Gretel, saw the father's house in the distance. They began to run, rushed inside, and threw their arms around their father's neck. The man had not had even one happy hour since the children were left in the woods. However, the woman had died. Gretel shook out her apron, scattered pearls and precious stones around the room, and Hansel added to them by throwing one handful after the other from his pockets. Now all their cares were at an end, and they lived happily together. That's the 1857 version. Now, that represents a substantial alteration of earlier versions of this text. In both the manuscript version of 1810 and the first printed version of 1812, the woodcutter's wife is identified unambiguously and repeatedly as the mother. However, with the fourth edition in 1840, Grimm's introduced the word stepmother, although they retained the word mother in some passages. The Grimm's final version of 1857, which you see here on your screen there on the left, refers to the woodcutter's wife once as the stepmother, twice as the mother, but about a dozen times, including here at the end, generically simply as the woman or that woman. The woman who sent the children into the forest isn't really worthy of being called mother. So she becomes an anonymous character who's literally written out of the story. Well, on a happier note, we have the valiant little tailor, also known as the brave little tailor. A tale that revolves around a lie that's perpetuated to great advantage by an extremely cunning fellow. The Brother Grimms published this tale in the first edition of Children's and Household Tales in 1812, and they based it on various oral and printed sources, including Der Wegkürzer, which means the shorter way, first published in 1557 by Martinus Montanus. A version of this tale was included in the Grimm's manuscript collection of 1810 and in all published editions from the first in 1812 onward. Now, as was the case with many of their tales, the Grimms, particularly Wilhelm, substantially changed this tale with the second edition of 1819. In this case, not so much changing the plot, but actually adding several key episodes. Now, what we do find in all 7 editions of the Grimm Brothers anthology is a consistent presentation of the 3 main characters. Now, our first character, of course, is the tailor. He's clever, intelligent, and confident. When people hear that he has, quote unquote, killed 7 with one blow, they think he had the strength to kill 7 people. Well, of course, the line refers to the rather fun fact that what he's really talking about is that he killed 7 houseflies with one swat. Oh, but you know something? He lets that misinterpretation perpetuate to his advantage. He uses misdirection and other cunning to trick the other characters, including various forms of psychological manipulation to influence the behavior of others, such as turning a pair of giants against each other and playing on people's assumptions and fears. Similarly, he uses decoy tactics to lure both a unicorn and a wild boar into traps, and to avoid being killed in the first giant's bed. Now, this reliance on trickery and manipulation by the protagonist is a feature we often find in the anti hero archetype. Now, our second main character, the king, well, he's very mistrusting and judgmental. He uses the promise of giving away half of the kingdom to persuade the tailor to take on seemingly deadly tasks. By the way, tasks that he doesn't want to undertake. The king is one-dimensional as a character and is essentially a plot device, but he's the source of the challenges for the protagonist to overcome to achieve a desired goal. And our third main character, the princess. Well, on the one hand, she's the prize for the tailor in completing all of these challenges. If he accomplishes them, he gets to marry the princess, and along with it, he gets half of the kingdom. Now, unfortunately, she's a social snob, so when she finds out that the person she's married to is no more than a meager tailor, well, she's furious and tries to actually have him killed. Her self-absorbed vindictiveness and its easy defeat is consistent with the stock character of the shrewish bride. She's also symptomatic of a theme you've probably noticed by this point, namely that women as a whole don't come off very well in many folk and fairy tales. There's a definite misogynistic streak in many of these tales. Women are either weak and need rescuing, by a man, of course, or, like the princess in this narrative, are petty and shallow, or, in the case of many others, especially the stepmothers, well, they're vindictive, cruel, and or just outright dangerous. Well, speaking of stepmothers and stepsisters, and misogyny and cruelty and we have our next story, Cinderella, known to German-speaking readers as Aschenputtel. Aschen is ash, so Cinderella, Aschenputtel. The primary source for the Grimm's text comes from an oral version given to them by Dorothea Weinman and other oral sources. Excuse me, it's Weyman. This tale was included in the first edition of the Children's and Household Tales in 1812, but was substantially revised for the second edition of 1819. This version is much more violent than the equally famous 18th century French version of Charles Perrault, and certainly far different from any Disney or Rodgers and Hammerstein variation. In the 1819 and subsequent Grimm versions, Cinderella's father has not died, and the two stepsisters mutilate their feet to fit in the golden slipper. There's no glass slipper in Grimm. Further, there's no fairy godmother in the Brothers Grimm version. Rather, help comes from some beneficent pigeons and a wishing tree that the heroine planted on her deceased mother's grave when she recites a certain chant. When she does this chanting, the pigeons come. So they're kind of the equivalent of the fairy godmother. And in the 1819 edition of their collection, the brothers supplemented the original 1812 ending with a coda in which the two sisters, for their cruelty, suffer a bloody and terrible punishment by the Princess Cinderella. The sisters are blinded by birds at Cinderella's wedding, and the story ends with this line, and thus, for their wickedness and falsehood, they were punished with blindness for as long as they lived. Now, this familiar story has been told in dozens of different ways and understood in countless ways. Yet, as Jane Yolen reminds us, no two listeners hear exactly the same tale. Each person brings something of him or herself to the story, and the story is then recreated between the teller and the listener, between the writer and the reader. Further, many old tales, like that of Cinderella, which can trace its roots back to ancient China, carry with them, quote, over the miles and through the generations, the bruises, blandishments, and embraces of the societies in which they have dwelt. So, in that sense, stories like Cinderella are really a part of history. Our next tale, Little Red Riding Hood, is, of course, the notorious story about a young girl who doesn't listen to her mother and a big bad wolf with an insatiable appetite. Its origins can be traced back to the 17th century to several European folk tales, including one from Italy called The False Grandmother. The best known version besides the Grimm brothers' tale was published by Charles Perrault in 1697. The Grimm brothers' source for the main story was Jeanette and Marie Hassenflug. In the Perrault and the early editions of the Grimm brothers anthology, there actually is no happy ending. A village girl is deceived into giving a wolf she encounters information that he needs to find her grandmother's house successfully and eat the old woman while at the same time avoiding being noticed by woodcutters working in the nearby forest. Then he proceeds to lay a trap for Little Red Riding Hood, and Miss Hood ends up being asked to climb into the bed before also being eaten by the wolf. And this is where the story ends. The wolf emerges the victor of the encounter. However, in later editions of the Grimm anthology, the story concludes victoriously. A hunter comes to the rescue with an axe and cuts open the sleeping wolf. Little Red Riding Hood and her grandmother emerge shaken but unharmed. It's kind of like a Jonah and the whale story. Then the hunter, Red Riding Hood, and Grandma fill the wolf's body with heavy stones. The wolf awakens, attempts to flee, but the stones cause him to collapse and die. Now, that conclusion appears on your screen. After he dies, then all three were delighted. The huntsman drew off the wolf's skin and went home with it. The grandmother ate the cake and drank the wine which Little Red Riding Hood had brought. But Little Red Riding Hood thought to herself, as long as I live, I will never by myself leave the path to run into the wood when my mother has forbidden me to do so. So the tale makes the clearest contrast between the safe world of the village and the dangers of the forest. And it also warns that the dangers of not obeying one's parent can really be extreme. If only Red Riding Hood had listened to the warnings of her mother, she would have never met up with calamity. Our sixth tale is called Godfather Death. Now, in it, a man seeks a godfather to protect and look over his child. Let me just get a little drink here. Okay, he wants somebody to protect his child. This is interesting. He doesn't pick God, and he doesn't pick the devil. Instead, he chooses death because death sees every person equally without any judgment, which, of course, the devil and God do. The child, it turns out, grows up to be a famous doctor. But when he attempts to trick his godfather, death has the last word and the doctor dies. Now, the immediate source for the story was an oral version attributed to Marie Elizabeth Wild. The tale was included in the first edition of the anthology. However, in the first edition, the story ends with the physician remaining alive. But in the second and subsequent editions, death pretends to help the doctor, but fails on purpose, thus killing the physician. In other words, you can't escape death. You can't trick death, right? Now, the folklorist Max Luthi says that, quote, every type of fairy tale portrays events which can safely be interpreted as images for psychological and cosmic processes. And what is more basic, more psychological, more cosmic than that most ultimate of all cycles, the beauty of birth and the inevitability of death, which J.K. Rowling adapts brilliantly in her 7 Harry Potter novels, which are classic examples, by the way, of a literary fairy tale. And if the image on your screen looks familiar, it's from the film version of The Deathly Hallows, which also deals with characters trying to outsmart death. Can't be done, folks. Folk and fairy tales like Godfather Death are an archetypal form of literature which help lay the groundwork for all literature and art. Now, I could easily argue that the bulk of all art and literature that has ever been created deals with the beginnings of things, the middle of things, and the inevitability of the ending of things. A life, a job, a romance, a friendship, they're all about that basic cycle. Now we come to Sleeping Beauty with a princess, a pissed off sorceress, a hunky prince, and a heavy dose of narcolepsy. It remains one of the most popular of the Grimm tales. Now, most everyone, thanks to Tchaikovsky's great ballet and the 1959 Disney animated feature, knows this tale of the scorned witch who curses the beautiful princess Aurora. Um, but there are fascinating variations dating back to the medieval period. Early contributions to the Sleeping Beauty archetype include the medieval courtly romance Perceforest, published in 1528. Now, in this version, a princess named Zelandine falls in love with a man named Troilus. Her father sends him to perform tasks to prove himself worthy of her, and while he is gone, Zelandine falls into an enchanted sleep. Troilus finds her and impregnates her in her sleep. When their child is born, the child draws from her finger the flax that caused her sleep. She realizes from the ring that Troilus has left behind with her that he was the father, and Troilus later returns, nice of him, to marry her. And in the second part of the tale, the princess and her children are almost put to death, but instead are hidden and saved. Now, I simply can't imagine in this day and age of Me Too and other social awarenesses that this Zelandine version of the story, or the Rapunzel story we spoke of earlier for that matter, would be even remotely acceptable. But in their day, Zelandine and the Rapunzel folktales and others like them were quite popular, and people didn't seem to object, at least openly, to a story about a vulnerable woman being taken advantage of sexually, especially since the man, quote unquote, did the right thing. He not only gave her a ring, but he came back. Now, even earlier influences for the Sleeping Beauty story come from narratives about the sleeping Brunhilde in Germanic sagas and the tribulation of saintly female martyrs in early Christian stories. The brothers added a variant to their version of the story. Their version ends when the prince arrives to wake Sleeping Beauty. Her name is Rosamund in their narrative, and they, of course, live happily ever after. Now, variants of this folktale have found their way around the world, changed and transformed to suit the society in which they emerge. Think back to that Yolen quote that I just gave a few slides ago. Studying this story and its various international and cultural incarnations allows us to understand the psychology of other people and ourselves. Carl Jung, Joseph Campbell, and Marie von Franz focused on the common archetypes that we find in old stories from around the world. Freudian scientists like Bruno Bettelheim, in The Uses of Enchantment, said that folk tales were not only a record of emotions carried through centuries, but were actually part of the child's rehearsals for adult life, which is why fairy stories and folk tales ring so true for adult readers, viewers, and hearers. So no matter what version of Sleeping Beauty we hear as children, we see life lessons. But as adults, we recognize ourselves, our hopes, our fears, and our innermost feelings. Our eighth folk tale is Snow White and the Seven Dwarfs, a story of a jealous stepmother, a huntsman, a prince, dwarves, and a pubescent young girl who comes to sexual and emotional maturity in the end. The Grimm source was Marie Hassenpflug and other informants. They published it in their first edition of stories, and they numbered it number 53 of the 86. The Grimms completed their final version of the story for an edition that they published in 1854. Now, Snow White features some of the most often used archetypes in myth, legend, and folklore. There's a mirror, as seen in the story of Narcissus. There's the poisoned or forbidden fruit. Well, you see that in the biblical tale of Eve. There's a coffin. Hey, let's think Dracula. And of course, there's the evil queen, who is the ultimate stepmother archetype. And it's the evil queen in Snow White who becomes one of the most remarkable villains in all folk literature. She makes Lady Macbeth look like Rebecca of Sunnybrook Farm. Now, yes, true to the Grimm brothers' ever-growing pious spirituality, they made sure she was also punished for her horrible deeds. Indeed, she comes to a rather horrific end. The final section of the story is on your screen. Let's look at it. Snow White's godless stepmother was also invited to the wedding feast. After putting on her beautiful clothes, she stepped before the mirror and said, "Mirror, mirror on the wall, who in this land is fairest of all?" The mirror answered, "You, my queen, are fair, it is true, but the young queen is 1,000 times fairer than you." Well, the wicked woman uttered a curse, and she became so frightened that she did not know what to do. At first, she did not want to go to the wedding, but she found no peace, so she had to go to see the young woman. When she arrived, she recognized Snow White, and terrorized, she could only stand there without moving. Then they put a pair of iron shoes into burning coals. They were brought forth with tongs and placed before her. She was forced to step into the red-hot shoes and dance until she fell down dead. I think we could agree that this is not something you would read as a bedtime story to a small child. And finally, our number 9 tale, number 55 in the 1812 edition, is Rumpelstiltskin. The story of a young woman who's taken advantage of by both a king and a dwarf, but who comes out victorious in the end. A little bit of a shift there. Now, the Grimm source was Thierfelder, who would become Wilhelm Grimm's wife, as I told you, in 1825. Now, in the 1812 edition of the Brother Grimm's Tales, Rumpelstiltskin, quote unquote, ran away angrily and never came back. That ending was revised in the 1857 edition to a much more gruesome ending where Rumpelstiltskin tore himself in two. Now, other versions in between the 1812 and the 1857 have Rumpelstiltskin driving his foot so far into the ground that he creates a chasm and he falls into it, never to be seen again. In the oral version, originally collected by the Brothers Grimm, Rumpelstiltskin flies out of the window on a cooking ladle, kind of like a witch on a broom. Well, the ending of the 1857 version of the tale is probably, for me, one of the greatest metaphors ever written about unbridled anger. "The devil told you that! The devil told you that!" shouted the little man, and in his anger he stomped his right foot so hard into the ground that he fell in up to his waist. Then, in a rage, he pulled at his left leg so hard with both hands that he ripped himself in two. Wow, what an absolutely great metaphor about the psychological cost of anger and rage. And don't we even have in our language that expression, right? I'm torn in two, I'm ripped in half, right? Your anger can pull you apart. Well, in the 1857 version of Rumpelstiltskin, that's what the Grimm brothers actually have Rumpelstiltskin doing. Now, once the miller's daughter, who by marriage is now queen of the land, learns Rumpelstiltskin's name, she has authority over him. The value and power of using personal names and titles is well established in psychology, management teaching, and even in trial law. In fact, today, in law, it's actually referred to as the Rumpelstiltskin principle. But above and beyond that, it is through the queen's own intelligence that she's able to win in the end. So, unlike other fairy tale women who need men to rescue them, the miller's daughter is very much her own hero. Now, for me, this is a story is one of the few narratives in the collection that I could argue illustrates a victory over misogyny. But of course, that opinion is surely rooted in my 21st century sensibility, right? Such a feminist reading would not have been the norm in the 19th century when the story was put into print. Now, as we move to our conclusion, I'd love to leave you with this quote from Jane Yolen. She says that tales are meant to be told. Storytelling, the oldest of the arts, has always been both an entertainment and a cultural necessity. And I would expand that a bit more to note that Joseph Campbell makes a similar point when he asserts that myths, legends about life and death, about our societal heritage, and about the nature around us are necessary to give us a sense of reason and purpose. As I like to always tell my classes when I taught this course as a course back in the day in colleges, before there was science, there was myth. Before there was formal study of history, there was legend. And for me, I would add that before there was psychology and sociology, there were folk tales. So there you have it, an overview of Wilhelm and Jakob's lives, a quick look at what we mean by myths, fairy tales, and legends, and some thoughts about 9 of the brothers' most famous stories. Again, you can do a deeper dive into all of those topics by going to my website, makingwings.net, and taking deeper dive number 9. And I'm going to squeeze in one more Jane Yolen quote. I love this. Storytelling is a personal art that makes public what is private and makes private what is public. So now, before we talk about our next program, it's time for your thoughts and ideas. Thanks for being here today.